I don't get the impression that he was had a very high level, sophisticated understanding of Judaism necessarily, but I wouldn't call him an ignoramus. I mean, he clearly had a grasp of Tanakh, a knowledge of Tanakh, and was educated in it. And he also was clearly educated in Jewish philosophy to a reasonable extent. He was familiar with the texts of Jewish philosophy, and he demonstrates that in every place in his writings. So I don't think that he was ignorant of ideas in Judaism. He certainly was familiar with the Rambam's ideas, and I think that in a certain way he believed that he was continuing following along the line of reasoning of the Rambam, taking it to a more developed level. But in general, Spinoza has a strange, or had, I should say, strange tendency to try to read his own ideas into the ideas of other philosophers, because he felt that his ideas were so compelling and so self-evidently true that he assumed that any great philosopher would agree to them. So for instance, he wrote a book, it's actually not a bad book, called The Principles of Cartesian Philosophy, which in the beginning is just like a perush on Descartes. And it's actually pretty good as a perush on Descartes. But then he starts to develop into showing that it must be that Descartes basically believed exactly my philosophy, even though that's obviously not the case, right? Even though it's obviously not the case, that he believed in the same ideas as Spinoza, because Spinoza went totally in a different direction. But he said, because it's so obvious to Spinoza that this is the way things are, so obviously any rational person who examined reality to such a depth as Descartes did must have recognized my idea of God and my idea of how everything fits together. It's kind of an unusual book. It's similar to Al-Farabi wrote a book showing that really Plato and Aristotle didn't disagree on anything.
Which book is this?
It's called the harmonization. I forget the exact name of it, but it's like called the harmonization of Aristotle and Plato. It's like literally on that. I have it. I mean, it's like nobody believes that, but if you think that Aristotle's ideas are so self-evidently true, so how could it be that such a rational person as Plato would disagree on such clearly, even though Aristotle himself is saying he's disagreeing with Plato? Yeah. It's a tendency in some thinkers to try to minimize the differences between to harmonize especially between previous thinkers and their own ideas. And Spinoza did that with Descartes, and he also does that with the Rambam, basically because he thinks that he's extending the ideas of the Rambam. Interesting about Spinoza is he never really denies the history of the Jewish people. You don't get the idea that he denies the historical narrative of the Tanakh completely. It's not like he just discards the historical narrative of the Tanakh. He engages with it, and he speaks about the prophets as real people and about the events as real events. He just questions the religious implications that are drawn from them. And I think that's his main concern, or his main interest, is to try to, in my view, is to try to liberate his traditionalist readers or traditionalist potential students from religious dogmatism, so that they can see his approach to God and his approach to the good life as the only alternative.
Beautiful. All right.
That's how I read it. But I find him an interesting person. I like iconoclastic people. He's certainly a lot more rational than most people alive today. There's no question about that. Just because people come up with wrong ideas doesn't mean their method isn't rational. It's a rational method. It reminds me, I always think of him as lahavdil. I have to say lahavdil, but like Rabbi Akiva Eger. When I was in yeshiva, they used to say Rabbi Akiva Eger's questions you'll never be able to solve. You'll never be able to answer them, because his questions are logically impenetrable, meaning he finds a logical problem. There's no way out of it. The only way you can ever answer his questions is if you change your premises completely. Okay? Meaning as long as you're working with the same premises, you'll never get out of the necessity of his conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is true of Spinoza. You can identify where his errors are in his premises. But if you follow his logic, it's not like he makes logical errors along the way. He's a very highly rational, intelligent thinker. He just had certain premises that I think we discussed in one of our shiurim years ago that led him to conclusions that he couldn't escape from. And you could compare it maybe to Elisha ben Avuya in the Talmudic framework of someone who basically came to certain conclusions and then could not escape from them, felt compelled to continue in a certain direction because of what he saw as what was necessarily followed from certain premises that he had.
Which is why it's so important to make sure the premises that you're working off is good premises. If not, you're just going down the rabbit hole.
That's why the Rambam is so insistent on that. The most fundamental thing is having the foundations. Once you don't have that, then what can be spawned from it is bad, even if the intention is good.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay.
Now that we brought up the Rambam, the next question.
Yeah, so we're gonna continue asking questions in the Rambam mold.
Okay.
Okay. So according to Rambam's negative theology, ascribing an emotion to God like he cares is an anthropomorphic description that is a false notion. Instead, we must say he's not uncaring. If that's the case, then doesn't that mean no actual relationship is possible? How does an infinite God relate to finite people? Furthermore, granting that he could, why would he create us in the first place if he has no will or need? If he doesn't actually care, why should we?
Why are you so concerned about what God cares about?
Well,
this is an example of the kind of direction of thought that can lead you down the rabbit hole that you were referring to earlier. Let's start from the second part of the question, if it's okay.
Sure. And
work back to the first one. There are two. Well, let me put it to you this way. Once you start talking about why God did something, you're already in trouble. Because in order to explain why Benji did something, I have to either refer to external circumstances that affected you and caused a response, or I have to refer to your internal thoughts or motivations or psychological makeup or something like that to explain your behavior. There's only two reference points that I can examine: your environment that's affecting you, or the internal workings of your mind or your psyche. Now, obviously, nothing external to God influences him, especially not when it comes to the creation of the universe where there was nothing external. And so that leaves me only one option, which is to try to psychoanalyze God or to try to fathom the thoughts of God, which clearly is impossible to do. So the whole question is something which can't be resolved by the human mind because it requires knowing the essence of God. You would have to know the essence of God to know. And so why God created the world is impossible for any person to know. And anyone who does claim to know it is projecting onto God certain motives that sound appealing to a human being, but are totally irrelevant to God himself, because even the whole idea of God having a motivation or a purpose in and of himself is making an assertion about God that is beyond our ability to make. So since the only way I can explain someone's behavior or how I would be able to explain God's creation of the world would be by understanding his essence, because that's all there is to work with. So therefore it's impossible. And so then the question becomes, so what do we do with purpose of creation? What do we do with relationship with God? So the issue is like this. You have to look at, let's say a person created opens a, I'm going to give you the most random example, okay? I'm just going to give a random example. Okay, Freud will say it's not random, must be in the back of my mind, but I'm going to say a random example, okay? Let's say somebody opens a car repair shop, okay? What's the purpose of the car repair shop?
To make money.
The Persian. Yeah. No, the purpose of the car shop is to fix cars.
Right.
Okay. Right. You're talking about the reason why that guy opened the car shop.
Okay.
Right. You see what I'm saying? So there's a difference between why the guy opened the car shop and what the actual purpose of the car shop is. Right. You pointed out perfectly. Right. Because the guy who opened it obviously wants to make money. But if he's actually not fixing any cars, he won't be in business too long. As soon as they figure out that he's not actually doing anything, like Jiffy Lube or something like that, where they say that they do stuff, we don't really know what they're doing it, right? So the purpose is, yes, to make money, but the immediate purpose is to fix cars. So I'm using that just as an example. Or you could say the same thing about a doctor. What is a doctor's purpose? Okay, he's making money, but his immediate purpose is to heal. Okay, he happens to make money from that. Some would say they love what they do and they would do it even not for the money. So that's very altruistic. But you're right that most people are in their profession to make money. Now, if you apply that to God, okay, lahavdil, but we don't know, we can't, the making money part is the personal motive. We don't understand that in terms of God, why he created the universe. We can't understand it because that would mean accessing the mind of God. It's literally impossible. And one of the errors that people make is that they think whenever the Rambam says it's impossible to know it, that means he's not giving an answer, right? We talked about that one time also. Like the Ravad also says that, and that's one of the things Micha Goodman seems to misunderstand about the Rambam, that when the Rambam says something is unknowable, that means he doesn't have the answer. No, the Rambam is saying that is the answer. It's unknowable. Okay, so it's unknowable, period. It's like, what does it mean to, certain things in mathematics also are unknowable or undefined. It's not knowable from our perspective. So we look at that, we have to factor out. So then the question is, what is the purpose of the universe as it stands? Just like we would ask, what is the purpose of the body shop? Or what is the purpose of the repair shop? What's the purpose of the health clinic as it exists? Not what is the reason why God opened the universe, or the reason why the doctor opened the clinic, or the reason why the mechanic opened the body shop. It's for the bottom line for them, right? We don't know what it is for God, but what, given the existence of the universe, is the purpose? The existence of the universe, the purpose is to manifest the infinite wisdom of God. That is clear to us. In other words, that is what the universe is. Why God wanted to create a vehicle to manifest his infinite wisdom and to bring about minds to acknowledge, recognize, appreciate, and follow his wisdom and cleave to him. Why he wanted to do that? Impossible for us to know. That he did it, that's the reality. So in other words, the purpose, the universe can have a purpose without us knowing why God created it. Just like a health clinic can have a purpose, or a mechanic's shop can have a purpose, or any other entity can have a purpose without us knowing why the person created it. Maybe the person opened, like I remember one time, Rabbi Abadi from Brooklyn, who now is in, I guess is in Dubai, right? He once told me he became a doctor because that was his family tradition, even though he wanted to be a rabbi, but everyone was also a doctor. So even though he had a small practice on the side, it wasn't his main focus. But he had a small practice on the side because it was his family tradition. So if I asked you, why did he open the clinic? Did he open it to make money? He makes money from it. I'm sure he made money from it, but that wasn't his purpose. His purpose was he wanted to honor his family legacy, that they didn't only make parnasa from the Rabban, from Rabbanut. They made it from a profession on the side, like in Syria. That's what they did. So he did it to honor the legacy of his family, to honor that value. Okay. So you see that the actual existence of the clinic was for a different reason. Even the purpose of the clinic was to heal people, okay? But his reason for opening it was different, let's say, than a person who just wanted to make money. Mm-hmm. So that would be hidden from us. We don't know what it is. We still could walk in and get healed the same way in his clinic as in the next clinic down the road where the guy is just trying to make money, okay? So we don't know God's purpose, why God created it. What we know is what its purpose is in and of itself. Within the system of the universe as it is, we can describe the purpose. And therefore we can ask ourselves, are we in line with the purpose or not in line with the purpose? And that's what we call God's will or God's purpose insofar as the universe is concerned, within the framework of what we're able to grasp. See? So that's similar to, I don't know if I ever spoke about this with you, but I probably did, about the Euthyphro question, which is the classic question of whether God, whether moral actions are good because God commands them, or whether God commands them because they're good.
Are you talking about Plato?
Yeah, it's a Plato.
Right.
So Plato asks that question. It's a famous question where the guy where Socrates meets a guy who's going to sue his father in court. It's a funny thing, right? So that's the part, that's the narrative part. There's always a story behind it. But the point was that each one has a problem, because if you say that God commands that things are good just because God wills it, so that means it's arbitrary then that the thing is good. It's not really intrinsically good, it's arbitrary. And if you say that no, God commands things because they're good, so then it's superfluous. So then why does God have to command it? It's already good. And you're saying that God's choice to endorse this thing is actually determined by something external to himself, because he's looking at a standard of morality, and then he's saying, oh yeah, this is what's good. So it's a conundrum. So I had explained one time, actually wrote a paper in order to be admitted to the doctoral program in philosophy in Catholic University, I had to write some philosophical paper. And I wrote what I thought the solution was to this problem, which is that it's similar to what we're saying here, which is, in a certain sense, meaning what is good can actually be objective and real within the framework of the universe as it's created, meaning what is good is what is in line with reality as it exists, as it presents itself to us now, right? But why that is the type of universe that exists, why that is the reality that we're faced with, that God created and we don't know why. So in a certain sense, it's true that God commanded it because it's good, meaning within the reality that we live, this is what's objectively good, and God commanded us to do what's objectively good. He educated us in what's objectively good. But the fact that that is what is good is because God created the universe that he created. And so from that perspective, what is defined as good was arbitrarily, so to speak, defined by God, because he created the framework that determines what is good and what is bad. So within the framework, you can have purpose, and you can have definitions of good, and you can have an idea of will, and you can have an idea of plan, and you can have an idea of all of those things.
What about
what do you mean?
Relationship?
What does a relationship with God mean? That's what I'm wondering. Meaning, a relationship with God is not a relationship with a person. A relationship with God is that a person knows, fears, and loves God, and that therefore they're living in line with God's purpose, and therefore God facilitates their continued success in the ultimate good, which is the pursuit of closeness to the ultimate reality, which is the pursuit of closeness to him. That's a relationship with God. It doesn't mean God is sitting thinking about you all the time, and he has your picture on his bed.
There is like, it seems like there's an existential crisis, an unbridgeable gap between us and God, but at the same time, there's the God of the Exodus, right? So he's directly involved, or there's some type of mechanism involved.
There's no contradiction between those two things. In other words, if God created a universe in which the ultimate objective of mankind is to have knowledge and fear and love of God, and that's how a human being actualizes his or her innate potential as created in the image of God. This is what the Ralbag talks about in the beginning of his introduction to the Torah, which I gave a class on it to some of the other guys a few months back. I think I shared it in our chat. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention that on this podcast. I guess you can edit it out. But we had a discussion about this, and the Ralbag talks about it. And basically, the idea is that in his introduction to the Torah, the Ralbag says that God's intervention, or God's that the primary expression of God's intervention, so to speak, or God's hashgacha, is the laws of nature that we see how they facilitate and they promote the good and the benefit and the advancement, the success, the thriving of each and every species. And so then, but mankind has a higher level of development and fulfillment and achievement than what the laws of nature can provide, because the human being has a mind and has free choice and therefore requires education to be able to achieve his purpose or her purpose, because education is necessary, because what we do is conscious. What we do is not automated, like or based on instinct like the rest of the animal kingdom. It's not programmed in. It requires free choice and assent and thought and understanding and so on. So, and this is not something that you can be forced to have. This is something that you can only be guided towards having. And so part then of God's plan for the creation was the development of civilization to the point that human beings would have a comprehension and understanding of God, and ultimately that a nation would have a comprehension and understanding of God, and then ultimately that the world would have a comprehension and understanding of God, so they would be living in accordance with the highest truths. Okay, that's not that is a relationship with God. That is God's side of the relationship. In other words, God's facilitating our coming close to Him, so that we fulfill our objective or our potential. We actualize our potential to the highest level. That's what it means for God to intervene. What was Yetziat Mitzrayim? It's an educational program to educate the Jews. Now that's that Moshe Rabbeinu is an educator first and foremost, coming to first enlighten the Jewish people as to an understanding of God, and then through the Makot to expand and deepen their understanding, comprehension of God, and then finally to challenge them to put that understanding into practice by doing the Korban Pesach and leaving. I mean, that's the and declaring their independence from the Egyptian culture completely, and their allegiance to God. That educational program is what the Makot are. The Makot are essentially an educational program, and everything, like the Rambam says, every miracle that God did for the Jews in Egypt was necessary in order to bring them to the state, or to facilitate their development in the direction of understanding of God and service of God. That is the relationship. That's it. That doesn't mean God has an emotional relationship with people, or that He's thinking about them all the time, or that He has some kind of a sentimental relationship. That's not the only kind of relationship that there is. This is the relationship. So that God designed the universe with a certain purpose, and He has put into motion all of the means that are necessary. That is a tremendous chesed. And it's a tremendous chesed v'rachamim and love. If you want to use all those metaphors, that's what it would be. I mean, think about a parent trying to guide their child, to educate them, to show them the reality, to show them the truth. The Makot are an example of, to demonstrate to them what is true and what is right and what is good, so that they can live the best life and actualize their potential to the fullest extent. I mean, how is that not a relationship? So it doesn't mean God feels lonely and He needs you to make Him feel complete or something like that. That's, obviously not.
Right. So in a sense, what the rabbi is saying is that the world, in a sense, bespeaks a relationship. The way that the world directs us towards knowledge of God is in itself that bespeaks the relationship.
Yeah. If you read Eov, it talks about that a lot. Towards the end, like all of nature. Difficult. Yeah, but all of nature kind of demonstrating that. But even I've mentioned many times that book by Nagel, the Mind and Cosmos. It's a difficult book. It's a difficult book, but I think that you guys would be able to follow it. It requires a little bit of philosophical background, but not too heavy. I think I wouldn't say it's a light reading. It's not as hard as the Ellie Goodman book. It's not that level of difficulty.
Len?
Yeah.
Not as
hard as that book, but it requires a little philosophical background. But it's an amazing book because of two reasons. One reason is because, and I've mentioned it before because of this. One reason is because he basically demonstrates in the book. He ended up being hated by everyone. Why? Because he basically demonstrated that evolution is not really blind, meaning that the universe is moving towards mind. That's why it's called Mind and Cosmos. He said everything in the universe seems to be instrumental towards, orchestrated towards bringing about mind and understanding and cognition, because it's such an impossibility, like a virtual impossibility, that human beings would reach the point where they would be able to comprehend the secrets of the universe and understand them, were it not for that part of the design of the universe. So that was the first point that he said. And so people who are, biologists and people who are hardline evolution, believers in evolution as a kind of a substitute for any kind of purpose, didn't like that, because they didn't like the idea that he was suggesting there was a purpose other than survival. Because basically evolution is based upon the principle that that survival is the only thing which determined the shape of the direction of how organisms evolved in nature. And so they didn't like him. But then he also said, I don't believe in God. So he said, is it possible to have purpose, that the universe has a purpose, but there's no God? Okay. He said, it doesn't seem to make any sense that the universe would have a purpose, but that there's no God. He said, but this is my position, because I don't want to believe that there's a God. Right. So he basically concluded that there's a purpose, but without any theology, without any God behind the purpose. As contradictory as that seems, as illogical as that seems, that ended up being the position that he takes in the book. So people who believed in God and wanted to use it as a basis for belief in God, or as a chizuk for the for some kind of recognition of God, were disappointed with that. And people who wanted to believe in evolution's the only factor relevant to evolution is survival, didn't like that. So he came out, not with very few fans in either camp. I like it because it demonstrates how a person can come so close to a true idea and can basically demonstrate, for all intents and purposes, a true idea. And then, because of their emotional inability to accept the conclusion, the obviously rational conclusion, what he himself realizes is the most rational conclusion and the most reasonable conclusion from everything he wrote, in the end, he has to backtrack from it because he can't accept the reality that he's been led to. It's kind of like God and the Astronomers, that book that where he talks about how, the Jastrow book, where he talks about how Einstein or other physicists were so close to basically demonstrating that there's a creation, but they didn't want to accept that conclusion. So they came up with creative ways to work around it.
Yeah, Einstein was not happy about the Big Bang discovery.
Well, the funniest part is that he's tried to solve the equations in a way that would sidestep that, and he divided by zero. He made mathematical errors because he was in his quest to prevent the implications of his own theory from taking hold. But in the end, he admitted that it was true. He wasn't intellectually dishonest. He was just resistant. Sure. Ultimately, his anava as a thinker won over, as opposed to this author, Nagel, who in the end says, I can't, even though everything I've written basically demonstrates the existence of a creator and of a purpose, I can't accept that. So I'm just going to say that there's a purpose without a creator. He literally says that. I mean, you could read the book. I'm not psychoanalyzing.